Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start off the way I do every year when I teach information privacy law. On the very first day, before we've really gotten into anything, I always ask my students to define privacy for me. I go and write it on the board, and many of the definitions and conceptualizations of privacy you would no doubt be very familiar with. And so it's the standard articulations such as the right to be left alone, or privacy is intimacy, or privacy is dignity. But by far, the most common articulation of what privacy is control. Well, not that control. This control, the kind of control, the ability to determine who does what with your personal information. And although it seems to be a little bit of an accepted truism in our world that the concept of privacy eludes definition, and I've argued this many times, looking around, it actually appears as though we've already come to some kind of consensus, at least with respect to the protection of our personal information. The name of the game is control. Let's look at the evidence. Mark Zuckerberg has long insisted that the way Facebook seeks to protect user privacy is by putting users in control of their personal data. But it's not just Facebook. Looking around the entire tech industry, you will see that the control is the espoused fundamental ethos that drives industry data protection efforts. The list goes on. Usually this notion of control is often linked to the ways in which systems are engineered, and it refers to the tools that are given to users that purportedly let them determine their own fate. It's also the defining concept for the Internet of Things as well. And actually, it turns out it's not just industry. Academics and advocates also adopt the frame of control as the dominant goal for data protection efforts. In fact, I must admit, I am in this boat. I have advocated strongly for control. I yearn for it for data subjects. I think that it's a worthy and critical sort of thing for people to have. However, it's not just us. It's not just advocates and academics. But where it matters arguably the most is with regulators. And when it comes to regulators, they seem to be all on board with the idea of control as the way to effectuate data protection. The GDPR, in fact, makes it quite explicit. But it's actually not just Europe, right? If you look around, the list goes on among those who value the control of personal information. In fact, control seems to be the one data protection principle that everybody can agree on. In particular, I think that control is relevant for the design of information technologies. It is the espoused dominant privacy goal for privacy by design efforts. The regulators seem to have embraced it. Informed consent regimes like the e-privacy directive are in essence control regimes. Privacy by design as a concept seems to embrace control at almost every turn. And in fact, in the United States as well, even the pioneer of privacy by design, Ann Cavoukian, has embraced the idea of privacy as control. Now, the arguments that I would like to make in this keynote is this. I have come to believe that control is the wrong goal for privacy by design. It's actually, I think, perhaps the wrong goal for data protection in general. The idealization of control in modern data protection regimes ends up being actually adverse, I think, to safe and sustainable data practices. Too much zeal for control risks deluding people and regulators about the potential efficacy of protection initiatives. If we are not more careful about the goals and values to be reflected in the design of information technologies, we risk building an entire data protection empire at the crumbling edifice of control. Now, building this out a little, I'd like to make two distinct points in this talk. One, I think control is a compromised concept for personal data and design. Second, instead of using control sort of as a proxy, which is the way in which we seem to be using it, privacy by design framework should embrace more direct values like trust, obscurity, and autonomy. Now, at this point, you may be saying to yourself, well, sure, if control is conditional, if it's vague, uninformed, and contingent upon action, then of course it's no good. But our industry/framework/goal is different. We advocate for real control. Now, I think that this kind of idealized control is probably impossible in mediated environments. And here's why. First, I think that control is illusory. It's a little bit of a shell game in practice because the control we are given online is mediated, which means it cannot help but be engineered to produce a particular result. When it comes to control, design is everything. The realities of technology at scale mean that the services we use must necessarily be built in a way that constrains our choices. Can you imagine a world where everyone got to dictate their own terms in an open text box with the services within which they interact instead of some sort of boilerplate term or standard set of tools? Our mediated perception of control obscures the fact that design funnels behavior, and people can only pick on the options that are provided to them. We give this sort of fake control to our kids very often. So, for example, when I give my kids a choice between going to the park or going to the movies, they feel empowered, and I get to avoid a trip to the pet store so that I can stave off a conversation about getting that new puppy. And so, I think that it's important to consider that design also nudges us by sending signals and making tasks easier or making things harder, encouraging us to act in predictable ways. Companies deploy dark patterns to exploit our built-in tendencies to prefer shiny, colorful buttons and ignore the dull gray ones, or shame us into feeling bad about withholding data or declining options, or simply making exercising control possible but costly through things like forced work, subtle misdirection, and incentive tethering. How many people have seen this ad pop up on your laptop and tried to click decline only to realize there's no decline button? You have to open up the App Store in order to get this thing to disappear. Here's an example of what Harry Brignall calls confirm shaming on his really excellent Dark Patterns website. Sometimes we get wheedled into oversharing through the design of services. Not only is sharing meant to make us feel good, such as keeping a streak going like here on Snapchat, or nudge us to share old posts on social media or congratulate someone else on Facebook or LinkedIn, but sometimes they just make sharing so damn easy. The key to keeping the data spigot flowing is to get people to want to say yes and to require the minimum amount of efforts to have them impulsively do so. Design has a powerful tendency to dampen skepticism. If users want it bad enough, then they can justify and rationalize lots of different decisions. Now, of course, we could create rules to mitigate against this sort of thing, but of course, the essence of design is to nudge people into a particular direction. Now, of course, these choices are not always harmful for us. Many of them, in fact, might be quite useful. But asking companies to engineer user control paves the way for abuse and self-dealing at the margins. And these margins matter. Even among those acting in good faith, we are left with the problem of relying on the notion of control and choice to do more work for us than it is capable of. We risk looking around at the robust new frameworks that we have for data protection, the rules built to encourage meaningful control over personal information, patting ourselves on the back and saying mission accomplished, but it wasn't even the right mission. The second reason that control is a compromised goal for design is that it is overwhelming at scale. Control over personal information is highly attractive in isolation. Who wouldn't want more power over the things that affect our lives? But within this power often comes a practical obligation. Sometimes when we do not exercise that control, we are put at risk. Companies can take our inaction as acquiescence. The problem with thinking about privacy as control is that if users are given our wish for more privacy, it means we are given so much control that we can choke on it. Some recent strides in design rules, such as data protection by default, actually does help mitigate some of this problem. However, even if the default works, demands are still being made of us so that we relent. Anyone that has turned off notification for apps like Facebook's Messenger can attest to the relentless, grinding requests of the user to turn on notifications almost every single time the app is launched. Many can relate to the experience of a child asking for candy over and over until the requests become too much to ignore and we finally give in, simply to quiet them. Willpower can feel like a finite, vulnerable, and highly subjective resource, and systems are designed to deplete and erode it. Once willpower and the ability to make choices become compromised, the control that users have been given will largely be meaningless. Even if industry figures out the Platonic ideal of how a company can give users and data subjects control, it still wouldn't solve another dilemma, which is the bandwidth dilemma. People only have 24 hours in a day and so many resources to dedicate to making decisions. Even if one company or all companies perfected a control interface, people would still be faced with the barrage of larger decisions because they use multiple apps and services. Control will not change the fact that the data ecosystem is mind-bogglingly complex, with many different kinds of information collected in many different ways, stored in many different places, processed for many different functions, and shared with many different parties. And even if every single tech company merged together to form some sort of giant Google Amazon buckle, then the tension between simplicity and nuance inherent in the most complex and fraught environments imaginable would seem irresolvable. This is because nuance often gets glossed over when companies try to simplify information for our benefit. Risk is either hidden away through abstraction or made so voluminous and explicit that we don't even know where to begin. Because, of course, the way in which control gets expressed in design is through things like this. But it's never just things like this, right? It's one toggle switch that exists among a nested layer of toggle switches that then exists among an entire environment of apps. And we look back and we feel overwhelmed at the number of choices. Privacy by default, again, helps with this, but the nudging will continue until morale improves. Now, finally, control is a myopic value for privacy, which I think is the third reason why control is compromised as a goal for privacy by design. Notions of individual control really don't sit well with privacy as a collective value. When privacy is thought of in individualistic transactional terms, people's privacy is always being negotiated against what others value. Control should be tempered against other values because no one privacy ideology should reign in a diverse society where other people's autonomy matters. What makes us think that the collective result of atomized decisions will be best for privacy anyway? Scholars have noted that a large body of research shows that people's privacy preferences are uncertain, they are contextually dependent, and they are highly malleable. The availability of knowledge doesn't necessarily translate meaningfully into good privacy decisions. Lawmakers may favor mandated disclosures, like the warnings on cigarette boxes, because they are cheap and they counterbalance the information disparity. The reality that companies often know is that they know much more than consumers regarding the wisdom of a decision. But in this context, users are being asked to consider the privacy implications of every single disclosure that they make, an impossibly complex calculation to make the future of risks and consequences very difficult to ascertain. Now, another problem with control, and this is getting a little closer to it, is that it leaves us sometimes lacking a more firm moral anchor. Control presumptively gives people choices and serves autonomy. But idealizing control can leave designers and data subjects without much of a sense of which values are really truly at stake to be preserved by the system's purpose or design. The lack of an ethical mooring encourages ideological drift and abuse. When control is the North Star, company leaders and policymakers aren't given much to work with when tasked with improvements. In the absence of more articulate values, CEOs and lawmakers say what is needed is perhaps more control. If something goes wrong, well, then we must not have had enough control, as though that would solve the problem. But it's not clear that more control and more choices are actually going to really help us. Maybe what we need are actually fewer, better choices driven by different moral values. But it's hard to rank which choices are good without a more concrete theory of exactly what we're protecting against other than just control. This is where additional values such as trust, obscurity, and autonomy become important. They give us a better roadmap on how to allocate the resources of control, which is finite and precious. We need an approach that incorporates multiple values and is capable of recognizing privacy as a more social good. Now, to my second point. We seem to be using control as a proxy. When control is expressed as choice, in a way, it sort of undercuts its own mission. And given the pathologies that are inherent in mediating choice, people should have a more fundamental baseline level of protection regardless of what they choose. What we have now in certain pockets is a system that allows companies to offload the risks of data onto the data subjects. Justifying control measures on privacy grounds requires so much justification sometimes, so much stretching and bending and tying ourselves into knots, that it feels like we're using control as a proxy for some other protection goal that's just out of reach for us. Control feels intuitively right, and it has selling power, so we use it. But what is the result that policymakers, industry advocates, and data subjects are really hoping for? Surely it's not control for control's own sake. Control ostensibly serves autonomy. But in mediating environments involving personal data, idealizing control actually seems corrosive to autonomy. Is control valuable because people have such different privacy preferences? Or does it just appear that people have different privacy preferences because personal data risks are virtually impossible for people to assess consistently across a broad spectrum? If data processing is so dangerous that it requires formal permission, and such meaningful control, consent, and choice can only exist in elusive, demanding, and bounded environments with preconditions such as freely given, specific, informed, retractable, and unambiguous, why aren't we allowing controllers to proceed in the first place? Is it just a contorted and indirect way to pressure companies to lay off risky data practices? If so, why not dispense with the pretense of demanding a form of control that seems destined to misdirect industry efforts towards a more formalistic compliance and a less meaningful change in process or behavior? This brings me to the point about design. For design, I think what matters are relationships and transaction costs. In other words, what is the nature of the relationship between the data subject and the person who's collecting or using the information? In what ways does the design of an information technology make things easier, reducing the transaction cost of any particular action, or make things harder by raising the transaction cost of any particular action? And when you take those two things into consideration and you look at what's truly, I think, important, the values that I think tend to rise to the top are not necessarily control. Rather, I encourage an embrace of the values of trust, obscurity, and autonomy. Now, trust, I think, is the key value for data protection moving forward. Trust, the willingness to make yourself vulnerable to the actions of others, is a key component in so many different aspects of our lives. It underlies commerce. It underlies our relationships and intimacy. And underlies self-exploration. And I think that if the rules that we have about the design of technologies are meant to make sure that the trust that is given is respected, then that's a much more concrete and in the end, effective way to channel the design of information technologies. And trust contains several different components. So I think that trust contains a responsibility to be discreet, sometimes confidential, but maybe just anonymizing or pseudonymizing data. A requirement to protect information by having good data security practices. A requirement to be honest, which I think may be technically different than transparency. Honesty requirements within trustworthy relationships mean that those that are entrusted with data are actually forthright about things that they might rather not disclose, but are actually important to the data subject. So in other words, we don't bear everything, we bear the things that are most relevant to the data subject. And then finally, and this is the key point, loyal companies and the design of information technologies are those that indeed reflect a loyalty on behalf of the data processor, that they will not unreasonably elevate their own interests above those of the data subject. The next value that I advocate for is obscurity, which is a little bit less popular in our existing data protection language, but obscurity is the idea that when information is hard or unlikely to be understood, it is to a relative degree safe. And we rely upon this obscurity all the time. We walk around cities being technically in public, but realizing that most people won't see or remember things that happen. Gossip that we engage in at restaurants, we freely do so, even though people are around could hear us, but chances are most people won't. We don't even remember the people that sat next to us probably the last time we ate out. And obscurity strikes me as a fundamental component of the ways in which we should channel the design of information technologies. When we have obscurity, when we have trust, and when we have autonomy, which I would argue is the value that control ostensibly serves, then we can have better rules for how our information technologies are created. We can have rules that may ensure that design is honest, that it does what it presents itself to do. We can have rules that prevent what I call abusive design. This is a triple negative, right? I don't not disagree to something like this. Most people do not affirmatively choose this option. It's when design leverages our own limitations to understand against us. And control doesn't always tend to get us to the place where the technologies would indeed avoid being abusive. And then finally, these values can help protect us against dangerous design that surveils things, that puts us unduly at risk. So, in the end, I think that lawmakers have more direct options than embracing control as the value for the design of information technologies. Prohibit collection outright. Mandate deletion. Get serious with purpose limitations and legitimate interests. Change the nature of the relationship between users and companies entrusted with their data to one that is more fiduciary-like in nature. Mandate non-delegable duties of care, duties of loyalty, duties of honesty, and duties of discretion. make rules to ensure that companies cannot unreasonably favor their own interests at the expense of the data subject. The case for privacy, the case against privacy as control is actually an appeal to more substantive and effective privacy-related values. By expanding beyond the notion of privacy as control, lawmakers and industry would be free to create rules and practices to ensure that designers, data processors, and controllers are trustworthy regardless of the control that we are given and how we exercise it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.